The soundscape of a traditional synagogue. It is safe to assume that the soundscape in traditional synagogues has not changed greatly in the past millennium. Some elements of the liturgical service have been traced back more than 2,000 years. There are a few things to know about music in traditional Jewish liturgical services. First, it is exclusively vocal. No instruments are used. The only exception is the shofar, the ram's horn, which is sounded in services during the High Holy Days and during the month preceding. But the shofar was never used as a musical instrument. It was and is a sound maker. The production of definitive pitch is difficult and is secondary to its main function as an auditory signal of some sort. Second point, it is exclusively male. Women's voices were not heard. Third, it is modal. Most of the chanting is done in modes other than Western Europe's major and minor. Each mode also is characterized by a set of unique motifs which are used as building blocks for melodic construction. Here are some of the scales based on some of the modes used in synagogue music. The first one, the Magen Avot mode, closely resembles the natural minor scale. The second mode, often referred to as the Ahava Rabbah mode, features the augmented second between second and third degrees, and sometimes also between the sixth and seventh degrees. The third mode here is the Ukrainian Dorian mode, which features the augmented second between the third and fourth degrees. The fourth mode seen here is the Adonai Malach mode, which is like a major scale, except on the top there is a minor seventh and a minor tenth. Here is an example of how a modal chant is constructed from its characteristic motifs as musical building blocks. When chanting the prayers for the Shabbat Musaf service, the cantor will begin with this motif. And then will generally follow it with this. And then continue each line of text with this recurring motif. Until the end of the paragraph, when he will use this motif. and so on throughout the service. Here's how that would work. Listen to this paragraph from the prayers.
תיקנת שבת רצית קורבנותיה, ציווית פירושיה עם סידורי נסחיה, מענגיה לעולם כבוד ינחלו, טועמיה חיים זכו, וגם האוהבים דבריה, גדולה בחרו.
As we've just heard, most of the chanting is rhythmically free, somewhat like Gregorian chant. There are a few hymns with regular poetic meter that are sung to metric melodies, but these are exceptional. Most of the service is chanted in the traditional modes in free rhythm. Only hymns are sung with newly composed metric melodies. Here are a few examples. Here is an example of a metric synagogue hymn, Adon Olam, sung by a Yemenite Jewish congregation. Notice also the improvised harmony in fourths.
Adon Olam, Ashel Mola, Badala B'Kol Yasir Nivela, Ve'edna Asoba Avsol, Azayva Shama Nigira, Ba'arek Enodekol, Abedayim Lachnela, Wuhu Yallah,
Here is another example of the metric synagogue hymn, Adon Olam, this time sung by a Sephardic congregation. And here is yet another example of that metric synagogue hymn, Adon Olam, sung by a congregation of Abayudaya African Jews.
Adoni Olam, Ashelu Malacha, Adoni Olamu, Ashelu Malacha, Biteremu Kolu, Yasiru Nibura, Lietina Se, Biefazuko, Azai Merecha, Shimoni Kila, Vehaharei, Kihalati Hakol, Levado, Imalu Hanala, Vehu Haya, Vehu Hove.
Fifth point. Everyone in a traditional congregation chants the same music, but not at the exact same time. Each person has his own tempo, rhythms, and variations of pitch, only slightly coordinated with those of the other worshippers. The traditional Jewish term for this style of prayer is davenen. Musicologists would call that kind of soundscape heterophony. These film clips that you are about to see demonstrate the soundscape that we have just described.
Yalelu
Sixth point. The cantor has several functions. One is to keep the chaos of the worship somewhat contained by chanting aloud the beginning and end of each paragraph. There are also some prayers that are chanted by the cantor solo, and the cantor is the person who chooses and leads the melodies for the congregational hymns. Seven. Most of these points are characteristic of all traditional Jewish liturgical services. However, there are some regional differences that distinguish each community of the Jewish diaspora. Here is an example of congregational heterophony led by a cantor during the weekday evening prayers according to the Sephardic tradition.
Amen.
There are many traditional synagogues where that same soundscape can still be heard today, while others, as we will see in later chapters, have modernized and westernized the synagogue service. Okay, here's a brief sidebar. We're going to jump ahead a few centuries to listen to a modern composition that evokes the unique sound of davening. Here is an excerpt from Lechu Neranena, a setting by Joshua Jacobson of Psalm 95, based on a melody by Shlomo Karlebach and the sound of traditional heterophony.
So
choral music in pre-modern synagogues. In addition to the congregational soundscape explained above, there are a few historical witnesses before the 18th century that describe what we might call choral singing, in the sense of an ensemble that has rehearsed and then performs what it has rehearsed before an audience, or in this case, before a congregation. Natan HaBavli, a Jew who lived in the 10th century, witnessed the ceremony for the inauguration of the Exilarch in Babylon. On a Shabbat morning, the entire community congregated in the synagogue, and then a choir of boys assembled under the platform, boys who had been chosen from the elite of the community, experienced boys with beautiful voices, experts in the melodies, proficient in all matters of the prayers. The cantor began the prayers at Baruch She'amar, and the boys responded antiphonally to each line. In the Middle Ages in Ashkenazic lands, by which we mean generally the northern and central parts of Europe, there arose a practice of having two singers standing with a cantor at the lectern to provide musical support. The zinger, the treble singer, and bas, the bass, were known as tomechim, supporters, or mishorerim, singers. An illustration in a 14th century prayer book from Germany depicts the three singers in just such an arrangement. The accompaniment provided by the cantor's two assistants was in most cases either improvised or worked out in rehearsal. The performances were not written out in Western notation. This practice typically called for humming of chords and pedal points, rhythmic accompaniments, harmonizing in parallel thirds, sixths, or tenths, and fillers to provide some relief for the cantor. In some communities, there was an ensemble of mishorerim, usually consisting of young boys and adult men. The boys were often taken in as apprentices to the cantor. On reaching maturity, they would go out and become cantors on their own. Let's listen to a portion of the Sabbath morning prayers led by cantor Joseph Malavani in the Eastern European tradition with mishorerim, in this case an all-adult male choir. One of the earliest descriptions of this practice comes from the writings of Rabbi Leone of Modena, Italy, in 1605. He wrote, If assistants who have been graced by the Lord with sweet voices stand beside the cantor and create an accompaniment without formal structure but simply improvised, as is the common practice among the Ashkenazim, and if it happens that they harmonize well with the cantor, should this be considered a sin? Charles Burney, the famous British composer, music teacher, and music historian, visited a synagogue of the German Jews in Amsterdam, probably in 1772. Here is an excerpt from his description of the singing of the cantor and his mishorerim. Three of the sweet singers of Israel, which it seems are famous here, began singing a kind of jolly modern melody, sometimes in unison and sometimes in parts, to a kind of tolderol instead of words, which to me seemed very farcical. One of these voices was a falsette, more like the upper part of a bad vox humana stop on an organ than a natural voice. The second of these voices was a very vulgar tenor, and the third was a baritono. This last imitated in his accompaniment of the falsette a bad bassoon, sometimes continued one note as a drone bass, at others divided it into triplets and semiquavers, iterated on the same tone. The tone of the falsette was very disagreeable, and he forced his voice very frequently in an outrageous manner. Now, choral performance, as we understand it, with singers performing notated compositions in harmony from Western notation, does not manifest itself as an ongoing phenomenon in synagogues until the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. That will be the subject of chapter 5. But first, in chapter 4, we will turn our attention to a few isolated but significant examples of synagogue polyphony in the 17th and early 18th centuries.